the Georgia Texas game. It was the showpiece of the weekend. It was the big end, the one that everybody was talking about. It was the biggest night game in a pretty good slate of
Woo!
night games. To
Yeah.
be real, it was a pretty good slate of night games, but Georgia 30, Texas 15. Georgia jumped out to a very quick lead in this game, and then Texas did its part in the second half to try and claw back into it. They did gain some momentum in the early part of the second half, but then things started to stall out a little bit. And I think maybe just as a starting point, we can talk about how Texas could not block the Georgia defense
No, my God, no. Yeah.
and how that dictated their play calling, the pace of play, the mistakes, the uncharacteristic mistakes that we saw in this football game. It felt like if you watched this game, that was the thing you couldn't take your eyes off of. The fact that Texas was dealing with Georgia in the backfield nearly every play.
Yeah, and it wasn't the mistakes weren't limited to Quinn Ewers and what he was or was not able to do under pressure. Carson Beck was not good early on in this game. There was just full on bad quarterback play for a variety of reasons, whether it was pressure, whether it was the back end of Texas's defense, which was quite strong early on in this game. Nobody really succeeded a ton through the air in this game. Georgia was able to adjust a little bit better and probably should have run a little bit more and gotten a little bit more creative with their run game. But no, this was a game just absolutely decided by the pressure and creativity of Georgia's defense. Texas not figuring out ways to get downfield and make adjustments on offense. The biggest adjustment they made was bringing in their backup quarterback in Arch Manning, but it did feel like it was a lot of dumping off just to avoid getting smashed in the backfield in this game. And so, we came into this game thinking, one of the strengths of this Texas team is what they're able to do on the offensive line in the way that they've been beat up at running back. Guys step up with, Wisner most recently. The receivers have been getting loose with, Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning getting plenty of time. But man, Georgia came in with their hair on fire in Austin.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was impressive the way that Texas found a way to kind of claw back into this
Mhm.
after halftime. It will remain a talking point, I think, that Arch Manning came in at the end of the first half because at that point in time, Sark seemingly needed someone with mobility, right? They couldn't
Down
block
20 to nothing at that time?
23 to nothing at halftime was what
Yeah.
they
I
were
know when
needing.
he came in, I think it was 20 nothing.
20,
Yeah.
yeah. So the fact that they brought him in hopes of maybe utilizing some of his wheels, um, is meaningful, right? And I don't know if it's so much a knock on Quinn Ewers as it is just an inability of Texas to deal with what Georgia was bringing at them. There were also plenty of instances where they were getting that pressure without actually blitzing, and that made it a much, much more difficult task to try and move the ball on this Georgia front. Flipping gears a little bit though, talking about what Georgia did on offense, 3 interceptions, as you mentioned, for Carson Beck.
Yeah. No, it was absolutely Georgia sort of tinkering on offense a little bit against this Texas defense. And you're right. I mean, it looked like Carson Beck was going to throw for a ton in terms of attempts, but ultimately, what it was Georgia capitalizing with opportunities that their defense was able to provide it. And Texas just, the kind of offense that Steve Sarkisian wants to run. You know that he wants to creatively get guys open downfield. And Arch Manning tried a little bit. And, there were guys that were open intermediate a little, but you're talking about guys that are open intermediate with Michael Williams' gigantic hand in your face.
Yeah.
And so kind of hard to parse out who is and isn't open in moments like that with that kind of pressure. So, no, to me, and I mentioned this to you, it was almost like Georgia hired both Alabama and Kentucky to hack into their team to expose vulnerabilities. Georgia looked like the more tested team going into this atmosphere, which was the clear game of the week. Texas had the drones forming. I don't know if you saw that in the second half, the drones forming the Longhorn artwork in the sky. This was enormous. And it's not Texas's fault that Michigan has fallen off to the degree that they have fallen off, but nobody has thrown a punch at Texas in the way, all due respect to Oklahoma, but they don't have an offense this year, right? And what Georgia was able to bring to the table was self scouting that Texas just hasn't had the opportunity to do. I think Texas is going to get better from this point.
I think they are as well. I am curious to see how Georgia evolves, frankly. This will be something that we need to pay attention to now moving forward because look, as we've been saying for a while, the SEC is kind of in a blender.
Yeah.
I talked about it on the previous show pretty comprehensively to your chagrin, but the push pull between the Georgia passing offense and the Georgia rushing offense, I think is something that I want to watch, a little bit more closely. They before halftime uh, still had some success running the football, and don't know if they necessarily did enough of it. Finished the game with, I don't know, just over an average of 3 yards per carry, something like that. So
Right.
that is one side of this whole Georgia conversation that I think we need to watch because if they can achieve better balance, as I discussed on Thursday, that would make them a better team. But suffice to say, you go to Texas, you win the game by a 30-15 score. That's a pretty incredible win.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
it's
how often?
notable
Yeah.
it's notable on the Texas side too that one of the other things we brought up was who had Texas really played from an offensive standpoint coming into this game.
Sure.
What was there any kind of speed bump effect, anything culture shock, right? Of playing suddenly a team that was drastically better than those
I
who had come before. I does that matter? Does it not matter? It may just be something idiots like us like to talk about, but it is times like these after a loss that you start to wonder.
I think the Texas offensive line was just tested in a way that they hadn't been. As good as Michigan's
Yeah.
front is, as good as Oklahoma's front is, I think the creativity of what Georgia was able to do up front. Like, how often does Georgia win a game in which its quarterback throws 3 picks? And I understand they still won the turnover battle. And how often does Texas lose a game in which they're able to force 3 picks? And it speaks to, I don't know, Georgia's ability to, to dig deep and stick to it, I guess. Like, there's a certain amount of resilience to Georgia, and this is a game that Texas doesn't lose 10 out of 10 times, but will lose 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 times starting like that. Like, you just can't
No.
come out of the gate that unprepared for what Georgia's going to be able to do up front and not be able to switch to a screen game, switch to the perimeter quickly and succeed. And Georgia's just better team.
They were the better team tonight for sure. But my final question on this game, then I want to move on because we got a lot to talk about this
Yes.
week. How far do you drop Texas? How far up do you move Georgia?
So where did they come in this game?
Well, Texas was 1, Georgia was 5 in the AP poll.
Um, I would drop Texas to around 5, I guess. I'm looking at the rankings now. I'd probably go Oregon 1, Ohio State 2. I'd probably put Georgia 3. Does that
I
make
think that's
sense?
fair. I don't know if there's a right answer for it. My suspicion is if I were voting, I will vote in our Verballer top 12 poll. I would probably put
Yeah.
Georgia ahead of Penn State.
Yeah.
But the fact that Penn State, the fact that Ohio State, that Oregon all are still undefeated. Well, I guess Ohio State's not undefeated, but the fact that at least Oregon and Penn State are undefeated, that will probably carry some weight. The Ohio State question will be interesting, right? That was a 1-point loss. My hunch is they might still get the nod over Georgia even after this win, but it'll be interesting to see for
I
sure.
mean,
Georgia's gonna get a bump.
Penn State has close wins against USC, who has a losing record in Bowling Green, right? Close, narrow wins against those two teams.
Yeah, look, I
USC,
get it.
are they a 500 team? USC?
No, not at this
No,
point.
they're not. No, we'll get there.
We'll get there. All right. So Georgia wins 30-15, a very, very big tectonic win in the sport this weekend. It was, of course, the big headliner.